Sveiki sugrįžę, čia Lietuva Amerika. Šiandien pirmas bandymas kelti laidą su vaizdu, nebeturim už ko slėptis. O mūsų svečias šiandieną tikrai vertas šio naujo etapo. Daniel Fried, žmogus, kuris tyliai, bet tiesiogiai prisidėjo prie to, kad Lietuva ir Baltijos šalys apskritai taptų NATO dalimi. Jis buvo ten, kur vyko sprendimai. Jis tikėjo tuo, kas dabar kartais atrodo nepopuliaru, kad užsienio politika turi turėti tvirtą vertybinį stuburą. Kai pas mus visokie žemaitaičiai ir panašūs valstybės griovėjai ima skelbti, kad vertybės tai atgyvena, supranti, kad vertybinė politika gąsdina tuos, kurie patys norėtų būti mažiau autokratai. Ir kaip tik todėl su tokiais kaip Dan Fried verta kalbėtis. Nes jis buvo tarp tų, kurie ne tik kalbėjo apie laisvę, bet ir ją pradėjo realizuoti. Tad tikiuosi, kad patiks jums ši serija ir pasimatom neužilgo. Gero klausimo.
Maybe better, yes, that is a better feeling. Okay, Dan, I know that you are in hurry, you are always in hurry.
No, it's okay. I've got an hour. I've got an hour.
Okay, little introduction. Who is Vincentas? This young guy, he's like young Republican, he's international secretary of our young Republican organization. It's called a bit differently, but essence is more or less the same. And he's third generation of Lithuanian Americans. His grandfather re-emigrated back from America, became our deputy speaker. So, you know, he's half Lithuanian, half American. Sorry, he will never say like that, but he's the voice of young generation. And we make that podcast, you know, a bit speaking about those troubled relations under construction, because I want to inspire young generation to invest into transatlantic link. Then, and you know, everybody, well, at least my generation knows who you are. Can you briefly say how much you changed the region? What was your role? Or you are very modest then, because
I didn't change the region at all. All I was one of those Americans who realized around 1989 that my country had a chance to reverse the verdict of Yalta and Molotov-Ribbentrop. And I set out to do that if I could. But it was the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Baltics, Czechoslovaks, they did the heavy lifting. They overthrew communism. They made a success of free market democracy. And then during the Clinton administration, there were some of us who could use that political capital to enlarge NATO and push for EU membership, which is what I did. But I was part of a very small group of people who believed that Yalta Europe was not the only Europe, that there was a different Europe possible, and that the Central and East Europeans themselves were prepared to fight for it, and we didn't have to accept the Iron Curtain as inevitable fate. So that's what I did. But the heavy lifting was done by the Poles in 1989, the Lithuanians in 1991, you know, around the TV tower, and all of the others, the people at the Magic Lantern Theater, you know, with Václav Havel, and the Romanians in Timișoara and Bucharest. And even the Hungarians played a major role in all of this, including the outgoing communists, decided to try to get to get on the right side of history finally. Long story, but that's me.
Well, if I may, Mr. Fried, just quickly correct you before we move on. Lithuanians, in fact, did our heavy lifting before 91. We did it as of, well, depends when you want to start looking at it. I'd like to say since the Second World War. But, you know, I'd like to quickly move on. First of all, it is such an honor to be speaking to you. I mean, I'm a big fan. I don't know how else to put it. You know, we in Lithuania know what you've done for us in Central Europe and Eastern Europe we know what you've done for the region, for Europe, for freedom. And I mean, you were there essentially from the beginning with NATO expansion, EU expansion. Looking back on all of that now, is there something that you would change so that we might not have the situation that we have today? Because that expansion and that, the end of the Cold War, it seemed like, as some political scientists put it, that it was the end of history, right? That we weren't going to have any of these problems that we have now anymore. But evidently we do. So what could we have done better back then so that we wouldn't have to continue fighting the evil empire to this day?
When I look back, we took advantage of what we knew was a window of opportunity. In the 90s, we were not actually naive about the possibilities in Russia. The Clinton people and Clinton himself settled on a policy of working with Russia, but also enlarging NATO. We hoped for the best for Russia, but we would not invest everything in that relationship. It would be a two-track approach. That was the same approach George W. Bush had. Completely different politicians, different views, different ways of thinking if they came to the same strategic conclusions. To answer your question, I look back at the Bucharest summit in 2008 in April. And I'll tell, I'm well aware that some friends of mine like Bill Burns think we went too far, that we should have opened the door or attempt to open the door to Ukrainian and Georgian NATO membership. Bill Burns has said so. But Steve Hadley's answer, Hadley was Bush's national security advisor, including in 2008. Hadley said, "I'm sorry we failed at Bucharest. I'm not sorry we tried." We did fail, okay? And I think in retrospect, our decision to go for a membership action plan came late. I was present in the Situation Room at an NSC meeting chaired by the president where he pushed this, but it was late. And we were slow in engaging the French and Germans. And therefore, the compromise language that we came up with, which, Zigis, you were pretty happy about at first, was flawed because we did it on the fly. And it was the next day that Putin made his first territorial claim against Ukraine, against Crimea. So I think we messed that up tactically. But Bush was trying to advance freedom as much as he could while he could. And I think he was right. I also think, who's the we? The Ukrainians, and I've told this to the Ukrainians. In the 90s, the circumstances were better, but they weren't ready. They were not like Lithuania. They were not like Poland. They didn't get to be like Lithuania and Poland except by degrees, a little bit after the Orange Revolution and the first Maidan, more after 2014, and then all the way after 2022, the big invasion. But by the time the Ukrainians figured out that their future should be with Europe, the politics were, the strategic environment, it's a nice way of putting it, was less benign. Russia was aggressive and stronger.
Dan, if I could just go deep into that, I remember what you said in Leonard Mary conference. We heard all those arguments against Ukrainian membership in NATO when we've been lobbying Baltic membership in NATO. And thanks God, Baltics are in NATO, because today we wouldn't be fighting for Bakhmut, we would be fighting for Warsaw. Well, more or less rephrasing what you said.
Correct.
And so would you agree now, Dan, when I heard, I still don't know what's happening behind the closed doors, on this peace negotiations, but when I heard one statement that Americans might demand Ukrainians to, get rid of their application to NATO membership, I was so shocked, and I immediately wrote to Zelensky's office saying, "Don't ever do it, please." Trump is not eternal, to be honest. This is what saves your future. When at Konrad Adenauer, German Chancellor, was faced with this decision, he said, guys, I will opt for, West German membership in NATO. And he was so strategically right. Would you agree that Ukrainians should never, ever say no to this dream that actually saved our souls, made us happy, made us safe?
There are a couple of things I would advise the Ukrainians not to accept. One of them is to recognize officially, legally, Russian annexation of any part of Ukraine. They can recognize de facto, as Adenauer did in 1955. They can promise as part of a settlement to seek to achieve the reunification of their country solely through peaceful and diplomatic means. Again, the Adenauer precedent. But they should not accept permanent annexation. And this is based on, from the American side, it is based on the Stimson Doctrine, the Wells Declaration, and the Pompeo Declaration that our friend Kurt Volker pushed. The second thing is NATO enlargement. If I'm a Ukrainian diplomat, I would start thinking of language which recognizes that at the moment there appears to be no consensus within NATO about Ukraine's ultimate accession. And Ukrainian recognizes that reality that exists at the moment, but then says nothing about the ultimate situation. That's what diplomats are paid to do. Find language that solves the problem without sacrificing the long term. That's what we're paid to do. That there are all kinds of language fixes. And the never is a long time. The West Europeans laughed at the Americans because of the Wells Declaration. It was our ridiculous American moralism and legalism. And the so-called Cold War realists opposed it. Well, it looks like Wells' doctrine and those who defended it were more realistic than the realists. Forever is a long time. Stuff happens. So the Ukrainians, it is prudent to recognize reality. I don't know what the American plan includes. I've seen various reports. I don't know what's true and what isn't true. So I won't comment on the various pieces. But there is no reason that Ukraine should consign itself to a gray zone of insecurity. That's what brought us to where we are. The Russians, and there's one other point. In the run-up to the big war, the Americans were ready to negotiate with Moscow about Russia's security needs in Europe. We said so. Blinken said so. And I believe that the German Chancellor, Scholz, who went to Moscow to try to forestall the war, offered to continue German opposition to Ukraine's NATO membership, which had been German policy. So, in the late fall of 2021, Putin has from the Americans an agreement to negotiate security and an agreement from the Germans to block Ukraine's NATO membership. And he goes to war anyway. Well, he can't get that deal again. And we don't have to give it to them because Russia's position is not all that great. And we should, if Trump believes in the art of the deal and believes in putting pressure on to get a better deal, put pressure on Russia, get a better deal. And I'm not against diplomacy with Russia. I'm against dumb diplomacy with Russia.
If I may interrupt you, Mr. Fried, you're absolutely right, and I completely agree with you, but that's what we're seeing. We're seeing dumb diplomacy with Russia. We're seeing Witkoff flying to Moscow to rebuild relations. We're seeing negotiations to have the Russian embassy in Washington, come back fully to operation, and all of these things. And we keep seeing, these gifts from the American side to the Russians when it comes to, we hear rumors regarding the theoretical American de jure acceptance of Crimea as occupied. We see all of these truce negotiations. We see obviously Trump's phone calls with Putin and so on. I mean, this is by definition dumb diplomacy, and you understand this better than anybody in America. You understand what we in Europe, and especially in the part of Europe that was once occupied by that evil empire, what we have experienced, and you know full well that this is part of the Russian DNA, the Russian cultural DNA to constantly, it is an empire after all, and you can't take that empire imperialist tendencies out of that very empire. So we know what theoretically we should do, but we see what you guys are doing wrong. So how do we work with that?
Well, Steve Witkoff seems to me a very smart guy in his own world. He's a real estate man. Don't ask me to negotiate a complicated real estate deal. Okay? Don't do it. There is a long history of Americans going to Moscow and not understanding what they're hearing. And Putin can be charming. He's knowledgeable. He's very smart. And I have a rule for dealing with the Russians, which is that they will pitch their level of bullshit based on their estimation of your level of ignorance. Therefore, know the issues. When I talked to the Russians, when I used to negotiate with them, I didn't need to make a big speech. I didn't need to yell at them or to stand on a soapbox and wave my fist. You deal with them professionally. Now, like Grigory Karasin, whom I worked with on Georgia diplomacy, he's no fool. He's a smart guy. You can talk to him seriously, but don't have illusions. To answer your question, there are some elements of the Trump plan that could work. Okay? A ceasefire in place, security for Ukraine, the Europeans doing the heavy lifting on that security with some American over-the-horizon backup. Okay? That could work. Other thing, there are other elements of American thinking that could work. Start with a full ceasefire. Black Sea security. Offer the Russians sanctions relief, but don't do it all at once. Don't do it in exchange for promises. Do it in exchange for action. And don't give away everything up front. And by all means, don't send all your pressure against the Ukraine, set all your pressure against the Ukrainians and no pressure against Russia. We put pressure on the Ukrainians, they back our plan. The Russians don't, so put pressure on the Russians. We have plenty of options.
Then, if I could just exactly ask on this going tough on Russians. And you just said also releasing some sanctions. So for me, this is kind of contradiction that I don't fit in my strange opinion.
I need to explain.
Yeah.
You lift sanctions on the Russians only in the context of their fulfilling the terms of a deal, and not on day one. What I'm talking about now is the need to increase the sanctions on Russia, increase the pressure on Russia, because they are not negotiating in good faith.
Exactly.
And you put more pressure on Russia to put Putin in a more reasonable frame of mind.
Can I just last a point that connects to what Vincentas said? Yesterday, I read the whole book of Lev Dobrensky. Thank you for also, promoting that book during our last meeting, DC. And we talked with Paula. And what I found in this wonderful book, because, I discovered so many fights, very similar to our fights then. And one element stuck in my head. Lev Dobrensky and other great Ukrainian Americans, they were promoting the idea that it's not about containing Russia. We have to liberate those territories, liberation as a policy. And he explained what Vincentas was saying. Russia is an empire. So deep interest of America, who is created by the people who fled from empires, to destroy that empire and make people free. So when I see Witkoff trying to glorify great economic relations with Russia, for me, I shiver, because it's like feeding the Hitler. Like, instead of complete annihilation after Casablanca, it's like, oh, let's feed the Hitler. He would be so nice with us. It's like feeding tiger who will kill us then. How to explain that it's in the deepest interest of Americans to destroy that KGB empire, or at least to put it on the knees and say sorry for what you did, for everything, to stop it? Because if, empowering it economically, that could be the end of us.
If I may add on to that before you respond, Mr. Fried, what Gigas is really asking here is, what is that Pearl Harbor moment that will get Americans back in the game, get you guys to really understand once again that this is indeed not just Ukraine's enemy, but all of our collective Western democratic and free, the collective enemy of our collective West.
What you are seeing in American policy, and I think you know this, is a replay of the fights in the 1930s and before Pearl Harbor in the United States between the interventionists and isolationists, so-called. The isolationists were hostile to Western Europe. They were sympathetic to Hitler's Germany. They thought Hitler would be a good ally to have against Stalin. They thought that the British and the French were useless, and it tricked us into World War I. And they supported Lord Halifax's view that Britain ought to not resist the Nazis, but to do a deal. And I see echoes of the same strategic debate in the Trump administration. Basically, there are those who would be very happy to do a sphere of influence arrangement with Russia, and they believe that Ukraine belongs to Russia's sphere of influence. Now, I think this is, needless to say, I disagree with it. I think it is a profound misreading of Russia's intentions and of our interests. Russia is an aggressive nihilist power that wants to not only overthrow the arrangements of 1991, but wants to reclaim the Russian and Soviet empire. And that empire includes the Baltic states, Poland, Finland, and wants to cast a shadow over the former countries east of the Iron Curtain. That's what he wants. It's pretty clear he will follow victory in Ukraine with attempts to undermine the Baltic states, or Moldova, or Romania, or both. Now, there's an interesting question as to whether Russia is an eternal enemy that can never change, or whether it is possible for there to be a better Russia. Now, it is a former Lithuanian leader, Adamkus, I think, who has argued that Russia could be better, that there is a democratic potential in Russia. Kubilius, yes, not Adamkus, Kubilius, of course, Andreas Kubilius. Kubilius has made this argument, and it is probably in Lithuania a minority argument. And I understand why it is a minority argument. And I also will acknowledge that the weight of historical evidence is on the other side. Okay? Like, I get that. But I still think Kubilius has a point. And I'm mindful of the views of my friend Vladimir Karamurza, or the other Russian democratic dissidents, some of whom are living in Vilnius. The way, and Kubilius says so, the way to a better Russia is through its defeat in Ukraine. Now, it doesn't matter what I think, okay? Our objective is not to provide for Russia a bright democratic future. That's beyond our ability to do it. I don't know that it's beyond the ability of Russians, but again, it doesn't matter. Our policy needs to be to contain Russian aggression, support Ukraine, keep the pressure on Russia until it changes course. I wrote a piece, I don't know, about a month ago about do's and don'ts for sanctions relief on Russia. You should read it, because I wrote it understanding that the Trump people might be looking at it, and I wanted to outline, the way forward and the things you really shouldn't do. You take a look at it. You might agree with some of it, you might not, but it was the best shot I had. But I'm not going to look at Vladimir Karamurza in the face and say that your cause is hopeless. I can't do that. I've seen too many hopeless causes succeed, but I'm also not going to sacrifice Ukraine. Well, okay, I'll give you an example of of a stupid policy based on hopes in Russia. I won't say who, but in 1991, an American diplomat I knew, I was still in the U.S., I was in the Foreign Service at the time, was very angry at the Lithuanians, very angry at the Balts and Latvians, because you all, with your drive for independence, were making things harder for Gorbachev, who was trying to reform the system, and you should be more grateful. Well, I did not take that well. And I pushed back, reminding this diplomat of the way in which Soviet power had been imposed on the Baltic states in 1940, and again in 1944-45. We should not sacrifice whole nations on the altar of being nice to the Russians in the hopes that they will be nice back to us. Don't do it.
Thank you.
They're never lying.
For everything. And just, I would like to finish again with this. My last dream, my lifetime dream, is Ukrainian membership in NATO, and I will fight for it. And I remember what you told me in one of those meetings in DC. Žygis, do you think it was easy to convince Clinton with first enlargement of NATO? Do you think it was easy to convince Bush to enlarge NATO to the Baltics? It was not. It was a hell of the work. So we will continue working. And what we have now, what is kind of new, we have Merz. And when I discuss with those Christian Democrats, and we will soon meet them, we will meet Merz in one of our Christian Democratic meeting in Valencia. what I hear from them, they are in favor of Ukrainian membership in NATO,
Right.
and that is a different from what Social Democratic Chancellor was saying. So now we are all united. We will come back to DC and ask again. And even if it takes time, we will work on Ukrainian membership in EU. That might happen by 2030. We will see. But then we will knock and knock again. You might have some elections in America. Well, you might have some new leaders, and we hope to solve it as it took some time.
Excellent. But one correction here.
Yeah.
So it was not that difficult to convince George W. Bush about the Baltics and NATO. In fact, here's a story. It was the late summer of 2002, before the November Prague summit where we made the decision. I was in the Oval Office and I can't remember why. It was just the two of us. And he turned to me and said, Danny, that's what he called me, Danny, if it were up to you, what would you do about the Baltics and NATO? What would you do? And I started as a good staffer to give him the various options and the pros and cons. And he cut me off right away. He said, I know all that. I know all that. What would you do? And I took a deep breath and I said, bring him in. He said, why? I said, because we have the opportunity now to advance freedom and security, and we may not have that opportunity later. And he nodded and he said, that's where I am. Make it happen. Now, he was not asking my opinion. He was asking me to find out whether I was the person to get it done or the person who would screw it up because I didn't believe in it. I later found that he had the identical conversation with somebody else on my team who was working for me. And he probably, if he had two, he probably had more than two. In other words, he had come to this conclusion. Rice could have gone either way. Powell was probably skeptical, but it was his conclusion. And he wanted to make sure he had that the people whose job it was to get it done believed it should be done.
Thank you, Dan. And
All right,
no,
that's the George W. Bush story.
no, okay, absolutely, and thank you for this answer to President Bush that might save our lives and future. But I think we will get to the moment when one of American presidents makes similar decisions on Ukraine. I just one sentence from Lev Dobrensky book: Russia minus Ukraine equals zero. Well, sorry, but I love that formula, at least for after everything Russia did with so many lives and territories and hopes destroyed. Thank you, Dan, for everything.
My pleasure.
See you soon in Vilnius everywhere. You are. I remember it was your farewell from State Department. I was still listening on radio from my little embassy on 16th Street. And they said, Dan Fried is an ambassador from capital A letter. I agree with that. You are incarnation of diplomat and ambassador we all love and remember. Thank you, Dan.
I've done my best for the common cause. Take care. And nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Su Dan Fried pakalbėjom apie tai, kas buvo padaryta teisingai, kas buvo pražiūrėta ir apie tai, kur vis dar galim pataisyti kryptį. Tai buvo pokalbis su žmogumi, kuris vis dar tiki, kad pasaulis gali būti formuojamas principu, o ne baimės. Ir žinot ką? Po tokio pokalbio pats irgi pradedi tikėti labiau. Vertybinė politika tai nėra utopija, ji tiesiog reikalauja drąsos. Ir ją labiausiai niekina tie, kurie tos drąsos neturi. Tada ačiū, kad klausėt. Ir jei norit daugiau tokių pokalbių, palikit prašau komentarą, pasidalinkit, nes dabar nelaikas tylėti. Dabar laikas prisiminti, kodėl dar nebijom gyventi laisve. Iki sekančių.